I'm Richard Chambers, the Senior Advisor of Risk and Audit for Audit Board, and welcome to my new podcast, Speaking of Risk and Audit, your go-to resource for actionable ideas and expert perspectives and real-world experiences to help you strengthen your organization's risk posture and tangible value across the three lines. I'm joined today by an old friend, someone that I've known for more than 20 years, and we've worked closely together in a number of capacities. Anton van Wyk. Anton, thank you for joining us for our new series.
Thank you, Richard. Pleasure to be here.
Well, I think a lot of our viewers and listeners probably know Anton, but just in case you don't, Anton just made a big move last summer and retired from PwC, the African firm where he had been a member of the leadership team there for a number of years. Very, very deep background in internal audit. In fact, at one point, Anton was the global leader for PwC's internal audit practice. I've known him for a very long time, and Anton made that career transition last summer and moved into the governance side of the house much more extensively than maybe even he had been in the past in some of the actions there, some of the activities that he was involved in. Today, he serves on the board of a South African bank, and on that board, he sits on the audit committee, the risk and compliance committee, and the remediation oversight committee. So we're going to talk to Anton today and get his perspectives on how audit committees can better interact with internal audit, how audit committees can better manage key risks. And so I think that Anton's background positions him ideally for that. Anton, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're also still very active on the King Committee and I believe the Institute of Directors there in South Africa. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, sure, Richard. I am. I've been serving on the King Committee for a number of years, since 1999. In fact, we're going through a little bit of and I'm on the subcommittee looking at a change to our governance code here in South Africa. And I chair what we call the Board Governance Forum on behalf of the IOD. And we've written numerous papers specifically that deal with governance matters that are, let's say, bubbling under or forming, through this changing landscape that we all live in.
Anton, I've always been fascinated with presentations you put together on governance and on audit committees. You seem to always have a really keen sense of where audit committees and boards have opportunities for improvement. Let's just put it that way. So we're anxious to get your perspectives today on how audit committees and boards in general can better navigate the current risk landscape. I think we've all talked about it. We understand that the 2020s have presented some rather extraordinary challenges for organizations and for the governance structure of those organizations. The landscape has really never been more volatile. And I guess my question to you is, how can an audit committee in this day and age stay abreast of sort of the changing risks, the emerging risk? How does an audit committee stay on top of it?
Sure. So I think the audit committee needs to apply its mind to the effectiveness, firstly, of the chief risk officer. I mean, I think that's really where it all begins, particularly if you're a new member. I take my induction process. When the first person I spoke to was the chief risk officer, the second person was the head of internal audit, the CAE. For me individually to understand more of what's going on. And I think, once you get that process rolling, it then becomes a lot easier to understand what the arrangements are for the risk management process across the entire business. I think they also need to pose the question as to how they can receive, as the audit committee can receive, more clarity, more efficiency regarding how risk is governed, how risk is managed, how it's understood in the organization, and also how it's assured. I've actually just written a paper on risk culture, and I'm actually testing it with my risk committee at the organization I'm on the risk committee of, and I find that a new development. We often talk about board culture, we talk about management culture, but the concept of risk culture really hasn't emerged to the extent that it should. And I think what is critical there from an audit committee's perspective is with risk culture is, how does the concept of risk, the understanding of risk, the responsibility of risk permeate across the organization. And you do that through a proper, concept of putting in a risk culture process. I think there's also no doubt that, we're confronting numerous challenges at the moment. I mean, one just has to look across the world as to what is happening. We're trying to assess what is required of the organization through this process. We're trying to manage through this disruption, and I think it does disrupt. This constant change in our world constantly disrupts any business, and I think that's becoming a key mandate for the audit committee. So it's not only looking internally, it's understanding those risks that impact that organization externally. I think also, now more than ever, management need to make sure that they have the resource available and the skill available to deliver on their risk mandate. And in doing that, and I'll speak a little bit about this later on, but having that ability to look beyond the horizon, being able to assess what the future demands are for that organization, to be able to assess what potential future risks might impact the way we manage and we remake our business. So I think in summary for this point, with a constant evolution of risk, the impact of combined assurance, the continuing sort of development now, what is recognized as modern corporate governance, and I would suggest that's another podcast for you, because I've got lots to talk about in modern corporate governance, dealing with changing governance landscapes, confirming stakeholders, managing for the short term and planning for the long term, all that sort of good stuff. But I think these increasing demands on the CEO put the CEO and their leadership teams under immense pressure. And that results in, I think, in increasing roles of the audit and risk committee in keeping a watchful eye on what is happening, close sort of liaison, close partnership with the CEO, and then applying a sort of a lens that is practical, pragmatic, and workable for both management and for the board.
Anton, I've seen audit committees over the years who get really frustrated because they get one perspective on the company's risks from the chief risk officer. They get maybe a slightly different one from the chief audit executive, and management, of course, is coming in and giving their take on it. And it can get very, very frustrating for an audit committee to know what the truth is. How do you go about triangulating to the real answer?
It's an interesting point, and funny enough, in my experience now, and I excuse me if I keep using my experience, and it's been an interesting journey because, it's been fairly new for me, to try and get to understand all these things. So I had a kind of a call it a 5-point plan, in particular my induction with the chief risk officer, and in fact with the internal auditor. I asked them both the same questions. But I wanted to know, how do I get to better understand what industry analysts say about our bank? I want to see both the positive and the negative recommendations that might have made for similar banks, both locally and globally, just to give me more insight, particularly in the industry. Now, I'm not talking here about, and let me tell you, it took many hours of reading, in fact, many days of reading the bank regulations and what the regulator and the prudential authority require of a bank in South Africa. Also, a specific focus on the industry's global risk landscape. So not just being myopic and looking at the landscape as it impacts our business here, but how does that risk landscape impact our business globally? I think also looking at publicly available data, you obviously analyzing peer companies, again, including views of leading analysts, discussing with the board's existing advisors. So I had detailed discussions with the external audit partners, there are quite a few of them on the audit. They have a compensation consultant, and I found that a very interesting discussion because they've also looked at the business in a very different way. So you get to understand the risk that they see, because they're advising the organization on how to compensate your people, how to provide them bonuses. So they have to look at the business from a very different angle. Also speaking to all the investment, there's a wealth part of the business of the bank. So speaking to those investment analysts, investment bankers within that wealth part of the business, because they also have a very different view on where the market's going and how it's going to impact the organization. And then obviously looking at equity and debt analysts. I think also there's a myriad of trade publications available that if you're selective to go through them. Government data, I think sometimes is very important, and then just reports from subject matter experts. So I think that in a nutshell kind of gives you, or gave me anyway, a better view as to where were the gaps, where were the issues, where could an issue arise if we weren't keeping an eye on it. And I'd also suggest, in particular, that the audit committee assesses effectively how mature the business's approach is to risk management, and then how they the business or management take responsibility for managing risk. And those are detailed questions of business, and that also takes a while to digest.
Anton, you bring a unique combination of skills and background to your role. Audit committee or internal audit often serves from a bit of what I call audit committee neglect. In a lot of organizations, a lot of companies, the audit committee knows they have an internal audit function. They have it in their charter. They have to meet with them periodically, but maybe they don't sort of look after the internal audit function when it comes to things like independence. How can an audit committee help ensure that the internal audit function in the organization that they serve in, that internal audit function has the independence to be able to tell the audit committee the truth?
Well, I suppose there are two angles to this. And the one is does internal audit align with the business in meaningful ways? And why do I say that when you talk independence? Well, I say that the audit committee should confirm that internal audit has established a close alignment with stakeholders, with all its stakeholders, that they've also built partnerships. I mentioned that earlier on as well, across the three lines of defense. That internal audit uses connections across BUs, business units and functions, to enhance its integrated assurance strategy, so to develop that combined assurance strategy. So why do I say that? Well, I would suggest that if internal audit get that right, and the audit committee holds a closed session with the chief audit executive, the chair of the audit committee should discuss directly, openly, transparently with the CAE whether the CAE is experiencing difficulty in maintaining independence while establishing all these liaisons across the business. And I don't think it's a complicated process. What I do think is that session doesn't happen often enough. So your head of internal audit has this perception that they might have an independence issue if they went to a cocktail party and they found that the CFO was there and the head of logistics or whatever was there. And they kind of then don't know how to deal with those things. And the way you deal with it is in that closed session, you seek out guidance from the audit committee. And you make sure that you've established these liaisons, you've established these partnerships. They are for the betterment of the organization. They're there to ensure that you maintain a sound control environment. And that doesn't mean that you've established deep, long relationships with the individuals. And I specifically mentioned those two words, partnership and liaison. I think if those open discussions happen between the CAE and the audit committee chair, and the audit committee for that matter, I don't believe there should be independence issues.
I think one of the things that's always impressed me about the King report is that for many, many years, and I know Professor King and yourself and others wanted to make sure that corporate governance report gave a strong shout out to internal audit in terms of what it could do. And I think that's still very much part of the underlying philosophy behind the King report, right?
It is, absolutely. And what has been good with this committee that we've set up to deal with they're calling it King 5, is internal audit plays a key role. In fact, all the assurance functions play a very key role in underpinning the code and making sure that their roles have evolved, and they have evolved. So, King 4 was, what's it now, nearly 8 years old. There's been a lot of change in our world, and everybody's gone through change. And I think the way this team has been structured is to ensure that internal audits still have a very good voice, loud voice, in fact, in putting their position into the code.
Yeah. Back to sort of focusing a bit more on the audit committee here. I wrote a blog last fall about the art of deceiving an audit committee. And it was a little bit of a provocative title. I wanted to stimulate the interest of potential readers. What I was saying there is that what typically happens, and this isn't just true of the audit committee, I think it's also true of the entire board, is that companies and management don't deceive them by telling them the wrong thing. They don't lie to them. Instead, it's just a lack of transparency. So instead of deceiving them through commission, intentional, it's more through omission. Hey, I just don't tell them these things because maybe, and there's usually an effort to rationalize it. There's like, oh well, we're not going to tell them this yet because maybe there's still a chance that we're going to get it under control or whatever. How does an audit committee make sure that it doesn't fall victim to deception by being kept in the dark about something that it really needs to know?
Sure. So, let me look at this. Let me kind of go through, if you don't mind, I'll go through in two sort of ways. One is looking at it firstly from an internal audit perspective, because I think they play a key role. The second is then looking at a board member, an audit committee member, and how they kind of develop their skills and their knowledge of the business. And the third then is how management then sort of react to the process of transparency. What is happening locally and globally, internal audit has to evolve to keep pace with a range of changes. So why do I say that? Well, the agility of the internal audit process has to increase with an improved alignment with risk management and other assurance functions through a mature combined assurance process. Now, you're kind of wondering, what is he talking about now? I was talking to him about transparency, now we're talking combined assurance. Well, I think that by establishing a strong combined assurance forum, a strong combined assurance model and process, you better leverage the consolidated risk universe across the business. And what does that mean? Well, it means that everybody gets to understand where the business is going, what risk the business faces. I often say that a mature, properly constituted combined assurance model is the surest way to finger a non-compliant and a non-transparent member of management. And I suppose that then, to me, talks to the audit committee's role. So the audit committee's role in the combined assurance process is fundamental in safeguarding a sound control environment. And I often say that the audit committee must stay engaged with key players on the combined assurance forum. It's also fair, I think, to say that directors now have a responsibility to be reasonably informed about the affairs of the company, as well as the environment within which that company operates. And the company secretary, in my experience, plays a huge role in keeping directors informed, in making sure that they see the latest developments. They see these from, we mentioned earlier on, from an industry perspective, a regulatory perspective, a business trends perspective. So this responsibility to be informed is one that rests with the individual director. So there's therefore a responsibility, I believe, on the director to actively seek out information rather than being this passive, ignorant part of the process. Now, if the director plays that role correctly and they're well informed and they understand the business, they will pick up where someone is trying to hoodwink them. They will pick up where someone is not being transparent with the information that they're sharing. I'm not suggesting here at all that, I always have this adage that the director puts their nose in, but they keep their fingers out. But it's the manner in which you put your nose in to really understand what is going on in that business so you don't get hoodwinked. And I do think that if you're not passively ignorant, then it helps in rooting out poor behavior by management, particularly where they're not transparent.
Anton, we've talked about the challenges that we've been through these last few years and sort of what the world is facing today in 2025. But what do you see as the most significant strategic risk or challenge for audit committees and maybe even entire boards over these next 5 years?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I think to my mind there's this, and we've spoken about it before. It's understanding what is happening in your environment. I think also for the next couple of years, we are seeing changes. We're seeing numerous things happening around the globe that an audit committee must be aware of. I think internally the same applies. So let me kind of start with maybe a few pointers externally that I think in the next 5 years. So I said earlier on, you've got to you sort of manage for the short term and you plan for the long term. And I would suggest these points are how well you plan for the long term. And this is over the next, say, 3 to 5 years. So how well do we understand this increasing pace of digital and AI transformation? Are we aware of not only cybersecurity, but the geopolitical cybersecurity threat? And often now we're seeing in the press, it's if it's not the Russian doing something, it's the North Koreans doing something. So there's an active geopolitical angle now to cyber security threats. So how well informed are we on those? The increasing regulatory burden. I'm seeing that firsthand. I mean, every week we're seeing new and changing regulations that are coming our way. I think also the sort of uncertain pace of a Trump administration and what he's going to put together and how is that going to affect both your economy in the US and the global economy. What changes do we see? How will that impact our organization? I think also this growing business model disruption, because business models are disrupted. Every time there's something that happens in the risk environment, the business model now goes through a change. And then, if you're not implementing 5 new computer systems or operating systems, you're doing something else in the business, and it's constant change. I think also the growing impact of climate change. How is that going to continue over the next couple of years? Changes in consumer spending and behaviors. I think also ensuring a safe and healthy working environment for our employees. I mean, just devastating what we're seeing in Los Angeles at the moment, and you kind of just wonder where all those people are going to go, where they're going to work, what are they going to do. What sort of contingency plans have we put in place in our organizations to address that sort of eventuality? I think also, and I mentioned geopolitical issues, but also this rising geopolitical volatility that we see in the globe, and are we ever going to see a stop to it? And how does that impact our particular businesses? And then I think an increased investor and stakeholder activism is there as well. I think also, the best value to me from an audit committee perspective is the value that they can add in considering and I mentioned this earlier, what is going to happen tomorrow. Have they the ability to have that sort of lens? Do they consult widely enough to ensure that lens is well focused on the future? So, and I think in essence, directors should give sufficient consideration to the future of their organization that they're overseeing, not just rely on management. Yeah, so I mean, I can say more. We should know kind of how the organization makes its money, how the organization will sustain value creation in the long term, how we determine inputs, resources, relationships, outputs, outcomes, etc. I think these are all important factors of having that future 5-year lens.
Yeah. So, and you touched on it earlier, talking about the sort of the being concerned about what lies over the horizon.
Yeah.
What we've discovered, if anything, in the first half of the 2020s is that what looks like it's coming at us from the horizon, number one, gets here a lot faster than it used to, and number two, is quickly followed by something else that we don't even see. And so, to me, I think you made the case for why audit committees and boards have to be concerned with the entire horizon and what lies beyond it.
Absolutely, and I think also, that the most difficult aspect for audit committees today is ensuring that the right strategy has been set and the right risk appetite levels have been established, because of this constant, the constant moving target that we face, and that is a skill. I believe it's a skill in analyzing the strategy, looking at the business strategy, the risk we face, setting those risk appetite levels, and I think that if you get that right, it goes a long way in kind of assuring your future.
Well, thank you, Anton, for being part of our episode of this new Speaking of Risk and Audit series. You've given us some great perspectives, great insight. I thank our listeners for joining us in this episode, and we look forward to having you back real soon.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard. And thanks to the Audit Board team. Appreciate it.